Welcome to the History Maps podcast. Consider being caught in a violent North Sea storm in the 10th century.
Hmm.
The water is freezing, the wind is howling, and the vessel you are standing on is not some rigid, unyielding structure.
Right, it's actively moving.
Yeah, the wooden hull is bending, flexing, and groaning over the crests of the waves. It feels like you are riding inside a woven wooden basket that is contorting with every swell.
Which is terrifying.
It is terrifying, but that specific flexibility is the only thing keeping the vessel from snapping in half and sending you to the freezing depths. So today we're undertaking a thorough investigation into medieval ships as part of our medieval history series.
And the mission of this deep dive into the sources is to analyze how conservative, ancient maritime designs slowly evolved through the Middle Ages.
Right, ultimately setting the stage for global exploration. For you listening, we are going to explore how these vessels adapted to war, trade, and regional climates over centuries.
We really want to understand the mechanics, the physics, and the sheer human ingenuity that allowed people in different parts of Europe to tackle the unforgiving nature of the sea.
So, where do we start with this?
The foundational element we need to understand, drawing directly from the sources, is what we might call the grand technological divide of medieval European shipbuilding.
A geographic split, right?
Precisely. Geographically and technologically, ship construction during this period split into two distinct, highly conservative traditions. We have the northern tradition, which was heavily influenced by earlier Viking vessels and the harsh conditions of the Atlantic and North Sea.
And then the other side of that coin.
Yeah, then we have the southern or Mediterranean tradition, and that drew its influence directly from classical Roman vessels and the specific environmental demands of the Mediterranean basin.
These two traditions didn't just, look different to a casual observer. They were fundamentally built using completely different philosophies of engineering.
They really were.
The northern tradition relied on what is called clinker construction. The southern tradition utilized carvel construction.
Which can be a bit dense to picture if you don't know shipbuilding.
Yeah, so to help you visualize this structural divide without getting lost in specialized maritime jargon, think of clinker construction like overlapping shingles on a roof.
That's a good way to put it.
The wooden planks overlap each other slightly, moving from the bottom of the hull upwards. Carvel construction, on the other hand, is like the wooden planks on a well-crafted hardwood floor.
The boards fit flush against each other.
Spot on. They sit edge to edge, creating a completely smooth, continuous surface.
That is an excellent analogy. And it is critical to understand that these methods were deeply conservative. Experimental failures in shipbuilding were incredibly costly.
In terms of money, right?
Money, resources, and human life. I mean, if a shipwright tried a radical new design and the hull split open in a squall, the entire crew perished.
Plus, a fortune in cargo was lost.
Yeah. Right. So shipwrights rarely attempted sudden departures from what they knew worked. They stuck to these ancient, proven designs for centuries.
They only slowly incorporated technological changes when exposed to improvements through wider communications across Europe.
Yeah, the evolution of shipbuilding was not a series of sudden leaps. It was a slow, cautious process of borrowing and adapting.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with the earliest northern ships and how the physical environment absolutely dictated their design and construction.
We have to look at the legendary longship here.
Yeah, when we talk about the foundation of northern shipping, the longship is front and center.
It is the quintessential vessel of the early Middle Ages in the north, developed over centuries and truly perfected by Scandinavian shipwrights around the 9th century.
And these were clinker-built ships utilizing those overlapping wooden strakes we just described.
But to understand why they work so well, we have to look at the actual materials. Northern builders did not use saws to cut their timber.
Wait, really? No saws?
No, they used axes and wedges to cleave oak logs along the natural grain of the wood.
Oh, I see. So the planks retained the natural strength of the tree.
Precisely. It retained the immense natural strength and flexibility of the living tree. When fastened together with iron rivets, these overlapping planks created a hull that was exceptionally light.
And incredibly strong, capable of flexing with the violent waves of the North Sea rather than rigidly resisting them and breaking.
Which goes back to your basket analogy at the start. They were designed for speed, agility, and a very shallow draft.
Which allowed them to navigate far up inland rivers or be dragged directly onto a beach, and they relied heavily on oars, right?
Yes, oars for propulsion, supplemented by a single square sail.
But the sources show us that the Vikings and their northern contemporaries were not just coastal raiders conducting lightning strikes, they were also extensive, highly organized traders.
They absolutely were, moving goods from the deep reaches of the Baltic all the way down south.
And for sustained bulk trade, a long, narrow, or reliant longship just wasn't entirely practical. That brings us to a vessel called the Nar.
Right, the Nar.
How did the Nar differ mechanically from the longship?
Well, the Nar is a close relative of the longship. It utilizes that same clinker construction, but it represents a crucial shift in maritime priorities.
A shift towards what?
The primary difference is in the hull profile and the propulsion. The Nar was significantly broader in the beam.
Meaning it was wider.
Yes, much wider. And it had a much deeper draft, meaning more of the hull sat below the waterline. Furthermore, it relied almost entirely on its square rig sail for propulsion.
So no banks of oars.
It carried only a few oars near the bow and stern for maneuvering in tight harbors, not for long-distance travel.
Which indicates a clear, deliberate specialization. They were stepping away from the need for sudden, swift bursts of human-powered speed required for a river ambush or coastal raid.
Right, and moving toward a design built for pure endurance and carrying capacity. That is the core economic reason for the development of the Nar.
It represents a shift toward sustained cargo transport in the early Middle Ages.
Well, I mean, it's quite clear from the sources. A square-rigged sail works essentially by catching the wind from behind. The wind physically pushes the sail, and the sail pulls the ship forward.
So by relying on this wind power and expanding the internal volume of the hull, the Nar could carry significantly more bulk goods.
Timber, wool, grain, furs across much longer distances with a much smaller crew.
Because you didn't need to feed and hydrate 40 rowers.
Right. You only needed a handful of skilled sailors to work the rigging. It was a dedicated cargo vessel designed to hold bulk items for trade networks that were rapidly expanding across northern waters.
So the Nar establishes the successful template for northern cargo vessels. And it worked beautifully for centuries.
It did. But maritime technology, even conservative technology, does not remain static forever.
As we move into the High Middle Ages, a new vessel emerges and progressively replaces the Viking-type ships in northern waters during the 13th century.
This is the cog.
We could essentially call it the heavy workhorse of the North.
The cog is a fascinating piece of engineering. It responded to very specific environmental and economic pressures. The name cog is actually recorded in documents as early as the 9th century.
But the physical ship we think of is later, right?
Yeah, the large seagoing vessel we associate with that name seems to have evolved later, specifically on the Frisian coast around the modern-day Netherlands and Germany.
Sometime during the 12th and 13th centuries.
Correct.
Now, I have to ask a question that naturally comes to mind when looking at this timeline. If the Viking designs, like the clinker-built Nar, were so incredibly successful for hundreds of years, why abandon them?
It's a fair question.
What was the socioeconomic or engineering catalyst for the cog taking over so thoroughly in the 13th century? Were the northern builders just bored?
Not at all. It was driven by pure pragmatic economics. The sources offer very specific practical reasons for this transition.
Cargo space, I imagine.
First and foremost, cogs could simply carry more cargo than a Nar of a similar length. In an era where the Hanseatic League was driving up trade volume across the Baltic and North Seas, cargo capacity was paramount.
The Hanseatic League being that powerful commercial and defensive confederation of merchant guilds.
Right. You wanted to move the maximum amount of timber or salt per voyage to maximize profit. But beyond just size, there's a distinct structural innovation that gave the cog a tremendous advantage in its specific geography.
And what was that?
A flush-planked flat bottom.
A completely flat bottom as opposed to the V-shaped or rounded hull of the traditional Nar. Let's explain the physics and geography of why that matters to the listener.
The flat bottom allowed the cog to settle completely flat and stable on the harbor floor during low tide.
Because the waters of northern Europe, particularly around areas like the Frisian coast and the English Channel, experienced dramatic, significant tidal shifts.
We are talking about water levels dropping many meters, exposing vast expanses of mud.
So when the tide goes out in these regions, a traditional Nar with a rounded hull will list heavily to one side.
It just leans over in the mud, which makes it incredibly dangerous and difficult to hoist heavy cargo out of the hold.
But a flat-bottom cog simply grounds itself and rests perfectly upright on the mudflats.
Precisely. Merchants could drive carts right up to the side of the ship, making loading and unloading highly efficient.
entirely circumventing the need for expensive, deep-water stone docks.
It makes perfect economic sense. It's a brilliant engineering adaptation to the specific tidal behavior of the region.
But the cog wasn't just a peaceful, defenseless merchant vessel hauling wool. It also featured high, steep, clinker-built sides,
Yes, and it was often fitted with elevated wooden towers at the front and back,
known as the forecastle and stern castle. The sources note these high sides made the ships exceptionally difficult to board during a sea fight.
which essentially turns the cog into an active defense mechanism against pirates.
The high freeboard, meaning the vertical distance from the waterline to the upper deck level, acted exactly like a floating fortress wall.
Because, remember, before the widespread use of gunpowder artillery, naval warfare was essentially infantry combat on water.
The goal was to maneuver close, throw grappling hooks, and board the enemy vessel for hand-to-hand combat.
If pirates or hostile forces approached a cog and smaller, lower vessels, they faced an arduous, near-impossible climb up the sheer overlapping planks.
Meanwhile, the crew of the cog, positioned high up in those wooden castles, could rain down arrows, crossbow bolts, heavy stones, and quicklime onto the attackers below.
This dual-purpose, nature-efficient, high-volume cargo transport, combined with formidable inherent defensive capabilities, solidified the cog as the dominant vessel of the Northern High Middle Ages.
In fact, cogs were so defensible they were frequently requisitioned by monarchs to be used as military transports and outright warships.
What's fascinating here is that the sheer utility of the cog meant it was not just confined to the cold waters of the north. The sources tell us that the cog traditionally reached the Mediterranean in 1304.
The northern clinker tradition, crossing the geographic divide and entering southern waters, that's a major collision of technological cultures.
It really is, and it was highly disruptive. The cog didn't just visit the Mediterranean to drop off goods and leave. It fundamentally influenced local southern shipwrights.
How so?
Well, the arrival of the high-walled, heavily defensible cog led directly to the creation of a southern variant known as the coach.
It's a clear, documented instance of maritime technology transfer.
Yes, where the distinct economic and military advantages of a northern design were recognized, analyzed, and adapted by southern builders who traditionally relied on very different methods.
Now, alongside the widespread dominance of the cog, the sources bring up another northern vessel. And this one has a real air of archaeological mystery to it.
Ah, the Hulk.
Yes, the hulk. The term hulk, stemming from the Old English word hulk, is first recorded in documents dating back to the 10th century.
And it was used specifically in port records to distinguish this vessel from a keel.
Which was the contemporary term for a ship in the Nordic tradition, like the Nar or the Longship.
The Hulk presents a frustrating but intriguing challenge for maritime archaeologists.
Because we have very little concrete physical data on its early form.
Right. Unlike the longships and cogs, where we have remarkably preserved wrecks lifted from the mud, we have no substantial archaeological remains of early hulks.
Nor do we have any usefully descriptive contemporary records detailing the mechanics of their construction.
But we do have early iconography.
We have seals, coins, and manuscript illuminations. And those early images show visual quirks that set the hulk completely apart from anything else sailing at the time.
They are depicted as having a hull that is strongly curved upward at both the stem and the stern.
Almost resembling a crescent moon or a banana floating in the water.
That exaggerated sweeping curvature is their defining visual characteristic in early depictions. The planking seems to run parallel to the sheer line, curving up to end bluntly at the ends.
Rather than running into a distinct straight stem and sternpost like a Viking ship.
And while the exact physics of their early form remains a bit of a mystery, we know they were highly successful.
Because they continued to be mentioned in trade registries and tax documents throughout the Middle Ages.
As we move into the late Middle Ages, stretching into the 15th and 16th centuries, the hulk becomes particularly associated with the Baltic Sea and the vast commercial monopoly of the Hanseatic League.
And as trade volume exploded, their physical scale grew tremendously. Let's look at a specific data point from the sources to understand just how large these merchant vessels became.
There's a really notable one in 1544.
Yes, by 1544, we have a historical record of a ship called the Jesus of Lubeck. It was classified as a hulk of 700 long tons.
To put that abstract number into a visceral perspective for you, 700 tons is roughly the weight of 350 modern automobiles.
Furthermore, that is the exact same size as the famous, terrifying English warship, the Mary Rose, We are talking about colossal wooden vessels capable of carrying immense loads of cargo across dangerous seas.
The Jesus of Lubeck is a crucial data point because it highlights the extreme evolution of the type from a small coastal trader to an oceanic behemoth.
However, the sources acknowledge a persistent unknown in the historical record.
We simply do not know how mechanically similar these colossal later medieval hulks were to their smaller 10th century ancestors with the banana-shaped hulls.
Because the later hulks didn't stay pure to their original design, they started to hybridize with other successful technologies.
Precisely. The shipwrights were practical people. There is clear evidence of hybridization with the successful cog form.
We see later hulks displaying both the upward curving hulk characteristics alongside the straight stern post and deep rudders of a cog.
Furthermore, there are strong suggestions in the archaeological literature that these late hulks were partially Carvel-built.
Meaning they were abandoning the traditional northern overlapping clinker method for portions of the hull and integrating that southern method of flush, edge-to-edge planking.
So the hulk evolved from a distinct, highly curved, entirely northern vessel into a massive well, an enormous hybridized ship incorporating multiple construction traditions to maximize its carrying capacity and strength.
It's a perfect, tangible example of how these isolated, conservative shipbuilding traditions eventually started bleeding into one another as European trade networks interconnected.
Indeed.
But while the North was heavily reliant on utilizing the wind with sails and clinker hulls to navigate the rough, cold waters of the Atlantic and North Sea, the South maintained a very different, deeply entrenched tradition.
While the North relied heavily on the wind, the South still relied heavily on human muscle.
We need to look at the Mediterranean galley. Why did banks of wooden oars remain the primary method of propulsion in the South for thousands of years?
It comes down to strict environmental necessity. The meteorology of the Mediterranean is vastly different from the North Sea.
The winds of the Mediterranean can be notoriously fickle.
You have powerful seasonal winds like the Mistral or the Sirocco, but you also have vast periods of dead calm.
Relying solely on a square sail in an environment where the wind might die completely, leaving you drifting aimlessly or blow constantly from the wrong direction for days, was a major liability.
It was terrible for both merchants trying to maintain a schedule and naval commanders trying to maneuver in battle. Oars provided dependable, independent propulsion.
You could move when and where you wanted, regardless of the weather.
Galleys had been utilized for trade and warfare in the Mediterranean since at least the 8th century BCE.
Making them an incredibly ancient, refined, and proven design perfectly tuned for those specific waters.
Let's put some real numbers to this to understand the scale of this southern industry.
The sources point to a specific transformative period. Following the Second Crusade, roughly between the years 1150 and 1350, the Mediterranean experienced an unprecedented economic boom known as
Flowing, populations were growing, and the demand for Eastern luxury goods was insatiable.
the commercial revolution necessitated a vast, organized increase in shipbuilding to keep up with the exploding trade demands.
This wasn't just a few shipwrights on a beach. This was state-sponsored industry. Italian city-states, with Venice being the prime example through its famous arsenal, aggressively scaled up their galley production.
They implemented essentially early assembly line techniques.
They needed ships that could navigate the Mediterranean reliably, adhering to strict maritime schedules, to move high-value, low-weight goods like spices, silks, and precious metal.
And they built them to an impressively large scale. By the 13th century, the registries show that Venetian merchant galleys could carry up to 500 metric tons of cargo.
Furthermore, they measured about 40 meters long.
We are not talking about small rowboats or Viking longships. These were extensive, highly organized, floating commercial enterprises powered by significant human labor.
Imagine the sheer caloric requirement and logistical nightmare of feeding and watering hundreds of rowers, pulling those heavy sweeps under the Mediterranean sun.
The logistical organization was staggering, and it made the Italian city-states the undisputed masters of the Mediterranean economy.
However, as advanced and refined as the galley was, it was environmentally trapped.
Galleys were far less successful and often disastrously unsuccessful when they attempted to operate in Northern Europe.
Right, because of the physical limitations inherent to the design of an oared ship. The sources note that to row effectively, the oarsmen need to be relatively close to the water.
This means the galley had to have a very low freeboard, meaning the main deck was situated precariously close to the waterline.
While that is perfectly fine in the relatively calm, short fetch waves of the Mediterranean basin, it resulted in a severe lack of stability and buoyancy in the deep, rolling, rough seas of the North Atlantic.
A long, narrow galley with a low freeboard caught in a North Sea storm is extremely vulnerable to being swamped.
Taking water directly over the sides and sinking. It was a fatal structural flaw for oceanic travel.
But that absolutely does not mean the fundamental concept of oared vessels had no place in the North.
No, the concept of utilizing oars for tight maneuverability and independent propulsion was still highly valuable, particularly in specific coastal geographies.
This led to the development and widespread use of regional northern vessels, like the Belanger.
The Belanger. This was a thoroughly northern interpretation of the oared vessel.
It was clinker-built, utilizing the overlapping planks.
Initially, they were rigged with a single mast, but by the time we reached the 15th century, larger Belangers featured a second mast to capture more wind.
In terms of size, they were usually small, nimble vessels of 40 to 60 long tons.
Although the registries do record larger vessels up to 120 long tons.
They operated primarily in the choppy waters of the Bay of Biscay along the French coast and the English Channel.
They were highly versatile vessels, utilized constantly for local trade, moving smaller parcels of goods between regional ports, but they were equally utilized for warfare and raiding.
But here's the tactical advantage that really stands out when you analyze how they were used. With the combined flexibility of banks of oars and multiple sails, Belangers were exceptionally fast and unpredictable.
Because they could maneuver independently under oars regardless of the wind direction, and still hoist sails to harness the wind when it was favorable.
They became the absolute vessel of choice for pirates operating in the Channel and the Bay of Biscay.
A merchant cog might have high defensible walls, but a Belanger could easily outmaneuver it.
Row directly into the wind where the cog could not follow. Choose the exact angle of attack to target the cog's blind spot.
Or quickly row away into a shallow creek if a heavily armed royal warship appeared on the horizon.
That specific combination of oars and sails offered a level of tactical, localized agility that the large, purely sail-driven cargo ships of the era simply could not match. They could strike and vanish.
And this principle of leveraging oared mobility in treacherous, confined northern waters brings us to another highly specialized regional vessel mentioned in the sources.
The Berlin. This requires a bit of historical context to really set the scene. Consider the volatile, dramatic waters off the west coast of Scotland between the years 1263 and 1500.
This region is a treacherous maze of rocky islands, deep locks, jagged coastlines, unpredictable squalls, and incredibly strong tidal currents.
Navigating a large, clumsy sailing ship here is asking for a shipwreck.
The dominant political and military power in this rugged maritime environment was the Lords of the Isles.
They used these clinker-built galleys, the Berlins, to project absolute power across their maritime domain, which stretched extensively over the west coast of the Scottish Highlands, the Hebrides Islands, and across the water to Antrim in Ireland.
They employed these ships not just for transport, but for outright vicious sea battles and to rapidly deploy warriors to attack coastal castles and stone forts.
The socio-economic infrastructure supporting these Scottish fleets is quite compelling because it was codified into the law.
The Lords of the Isles didn't just hire mercenaries, they operated under a strict feudal quota system where specific landholdings owed specific fully crewed vessels to the lord upon demand.
The sources give us exact, fascinating numbers on this. The Isle of Man, for instance, was required by feudal obligation to provide 6 galleys of 26 oars each.
Another holding, Sleat on the Isle of Skye, had to provide one 18-oar galley.
It was a deeply ingrained system of naval obligation tied directly to the ownership of the land. If you held the land, you had to supply the ships to defend the realm.
It was essentially a maritime military draft.
Right.
And we have credible physical, archaeological evidence of how these specific ships evolved over time.
Right, the carvings.
Yes, carvings on stone tombstones scattered across the Scottish Islands dating from 1350 onward provide a detailed visual record of their construction.
A crucial, highly significant technological shift is visible in these carvings. From the 14th century, these ships abandoned the traditional ancient side steering oar, the large paddle fixed to the right side of the ship near the back.
And what did they replace it with?
A modern stern rudder mounted directly on the center line. To accommodate this new rudder, they adopted a straight, vertical stern post.
The sources also provide a very specific, codified hierarchy for these Scottish vessels based on a historical document dating from 1624.
The classification was entirely dependent on the vessel's propulsion power.
A galley proper, the largest of the fleet, would have 18 to 24 oars.
A Berlin, the mid-sized vessel, would have 12 to 18 oars.
And a Limfad, the smallest utility craft, would have fewer still. The terminology was strictly tied to the number of oars, which dictated the vessel's size, speed, and troop-carrying capability.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the adoption of the centerline stern rudder on these regional Scottish-oared ships is deeply significant in the broader history of maritime technology.
It foreshadows the major steering revolution that would shortly occur in the great oceanic sailing ships of the late Middle Ages.
Moving the rudder from the side of the hull to the stern post on the centerline provides vastly superior steering control.
When a ship rolls heavily in a rough sea, a side-mounted oar can be lifted entirely out of the water, leaving the ship completely unsteerable.
But a centerline rudder stays submerged, utilizing the flow of water directly along the keel, providing leverage and control no matter how violently the ship is pitching.
Here's where it gets really interesting,
Oh, absolutely.
because this transition to the stern rudder coincides perfectly with the rise of what we can call the Southern Revolution in shipbuilding.
This is the era that changes the map of the world. This is the era of the Portuguese caravel.
The caravel represents a truly pivotal moment in global maritime engineering. Developed by the Portuguese in the 13th century, it initially served a very humble, practical purpose.
It was used for local fishing and return coastal cargo work along the Iberian Peninsula.
However, by the 1440s, under the patronage of figures like Prince Henry the Navigator, the design had been recognized for its inherent strengths.
And specifically adapted for a much grander, far more dangerous purpose: oceanic exploration down the uncharted coast of Africa.
And the physical construction of the hull is the key to its success. Unlike the northern longship and the merchant cog, the caravel utilized the southern Carvel method of construction.
We are talking about flush wooden planks, creating a completely smooth hull.
And, as we just discussed with the Scottish Berlin, it utilized a sturdy, centerline sternpost-mounted rudder rather than a fragile side-mounted steering oar.
But why was this smooth hull better for exploration than the overlapping clinker hull?
The Carvel hull provided immense structural advantages as ships got larger. Clinker hulls, while flexible and light, become incredibly difficult to seal and maintain as the ship scales up in size.
The iron rivets strain and pop, and the overlapping seams leak under the immense stress of ocean swells.
Carvel construction, where the planks are fastened flush to a heavy internal wooden skeleton, creates a rigid, incredibly strong structure.
The seams between the flush planks are then driven full of oakum, unpicked old ropes and sealed tightly with hot pitch.
This creates a watertight seal that can withstand the sheer longitudinal stress of sailing in the open Atlantic.
Let's break down the rigging options, because this is where the caravel demonstrated its absolute versatility for explorers facing unknown wind patterns.
The rigging was brilliant. A caravel could be lateen rigged, which was known specifically as the caravella latina.
A lateen rig utilizes enormous triangular sails suspended on long yards.
The physics of a lateen sail are entirely different from a square sail. Instead of just catching the wind from behind, a lateen sail acts essentially like the wing of an airplane.
It creates a pressure differential that generates lift, allowing the ship to sail much closer into the wind.
This was critical for explorers trying to return north to Portugal against the prevailing trade winds off the African coast.
Alternatively, for long voyages running with the wind, the ship could utilize a mix of traditional square sails and lateen sails.
A configuration known as the caravella redonda.
To put some real names to this technology for you listening, we only need to mention the most famous examples of caravels in human history.
Christopher Columbus's ships, the Nina and the Pinta.
These relatively small vessels successfully crossed the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, precisely because their specialized design allowed them to navigate complex contrary wind patterns that older, purely square-rigged cogs would have been utterly trapped by.
The caravel design was so phenomenally effective that by the 1430s, it became increasingly common to see them operating in northern European waters, far from their Iberian home.
The spread of this single superior vessel type actually forced northern shipyards, situated entirely outside of the Mediterranean sphere, to painstakingly learn and adopt the complex southern carvel construction methods to remain competitive.
The Caravel was the vanguard. It was the agile scout ship of the Age of Discovery.
But as the scope of global exploration and transoceanic trade rapidly expanded, a scout was no longer enough. You cannot build a global empire carrying cargo in a small scout ship,
The emerging empires needed a heavy transporter.
which scales up the conversation significantly to the Carrack.
If the Caravel was the agile scout, the Carrack was a heavy lifter of the seas.
Invented in southern Europe in the 15th century and particularly developed and refined in Portugal, it was a significantly larger, much deeper draft vessel than the Caravel.
The sources cite incredibly famous historical examples of the Carrack, including Columbus's heavy flagship, the Santa Maria, and Vasco da Gama's ship that opened the sea route to India, the San Gabriel.
The San Gabriel gives us a perfect opportunity to deeply analyze the rigging complexity of these late medieval giants. We are looking at a ship equipped with 6 sails.
It featured a bowsprit projecting from the front, a foresail, a mainmast, a mizzenmast near the rear, a spritsail under the bowsprit, and 2 topsails hoisted high above the main deck.
That complex, multi-masted configuration represents the absolute pinnacle of late medieval maritime engineering.
Previously, builders just tried to make a single mast bigger to hold a larger sail, which made the ship dangerously top-heavy.
By dividing the total sail area across multiple masts, shipwrights lowered the center of effort, making the ship much more stable.
Furthermore, by combining large square sails on the fore and main masts for tremendous downwind speed, with triangular lateen sails on the mizzenmast for tight maneuverability and steering balance, they created a vessel capable of crossing vast oceans.
Carrying substantial cargo, provisions for a large crew, and heavy armament.
Which leads to an inevitable question of technological exchange. How did this immense, highly complex southern invention influence the cold waters of the North?
Because the sources provide us with a truly extraordinary, tangible archaeological example of a northern-built carrack.
This raises an important question regarding how monarchs projected state power during this era. The ultimate, most pristine archaeological example of a northern carrack is the Danish-Norwegian royal flagship known as the Gribsunden.
This phenomenal vessel sank off the coast of modern-day Sweden in June of 1495 after catching fire.
The physical data on its origin is fascinating and shows how interconnected Europe had become. The Gribsunden was probably built in the Low Countries near modern-day Rotterdam around 1485.
Dendrochronology, the study of tree rings, shows that the timber used for its construction was cut far inland in the River Meuse watershed of the Ardennes forest.
In terms of dimensions, it was a monster for its time. It had a keel length of about 25.5 meters and an overall length exceeding 30 meters.
For the Baltic Sea at the end of the 15th century, it was an exceptionally large, dominating ship.
Modern archaeological excavation of the wreck site has confirmed that it possessed a fully Carvel-built hull.
This firmly and physically demonstrates the complete adoption of southern, flush-planked construction techniques in the shipyards of the North.
Furthermore, the wreck shows it carried 3 masts, directly mirroring the complex divided rigging we discussed with the southern carrack.
It is entirely accurate to describe the Gribsunden as a literal mobile castle.
It was not just a warship. It was designed to serve every political and diplomatic need of the king as he traveled throughout his maritime realm to project dominance.
It featured a towering forecastle at the bow and a multi-tiered lap-strake stern castle at the rear, and critically, it was heavily armed.
Wow.
It carried as many as 68 early artillery pieces.
The integration of that artillery is why the Carvel hull was so necessary. If you fire a heavy gunpowder weapon on a clinker-built ship, the violent shockwave and recoil will shatter the iron rivets and shake the overlapping planks apart, causing the ship to leak and sink.
The thick flush planks and heavy internal framing of a Carvel hull could absorb the immense kinetic energy of a broadside.
The archaeological value of the Gribsunden cannot be overstated. Because it sank quickly without being salvaged, it created an underwater time capsule.
Excavators have found incredibly fragile plant remains, specifically exotic spices, which belong to the king's personal spice cabinet.
Discovering these incredibly expensive luxury goods alongside extensive, heavy shipboard artillery provides a perfect, pristine snapshot of elite, Late medieval life, economics, and warfare at sea.
It shows us exactly how political power and vast wealth were concentrated and physically mobilized on these complex vessels. It is a profound, imposing image of royal authority on the water.
But to ensure you truly understand the full maritime ecosystem of the era, we must pivot.
History is not just about kings. It was not all royal flagships, heavy transoceanic carracks, and famous explorers.
We have to look at the small vessels, the absolute unsung heroes of medieval waters. Without them, the entire system collapses.
The sources name a number of smaller working-class ships of the late Middle Ages that continued to operate well into the 16th century. Let's examine them, because their utility was the bedrock of the economy. First, we have the Creer.
The Creer was a sturdy, modest vessel of roughly 20 to 50 tons, utilized constantly for cross-channel trade between England and the continent, moving everyday goods like ale, grain, and cloth.
Then there is the Hoy, which originated in the shipyards of Flanders in the 15th century.
It was a single-masted vessel, usually ranging from 25 to 80 long tons. It functioned as a tireless coaster on short sea routes, hopping from port to port.
Or crucially, as a lighter. A lighter is a specialized vessel used to ferry heavy goods from a shallow port out to much larger ships anchored in deep water.
The Hoy design was so incredibly effective and efficient that the type continuously evolved through the 16th and 17th centuries, only finally disappearing with the advent of steam power in the early 19th century.
And finally, we have the Picard, a type first recorded in port registers in the 1320s.
This was a very small, single-masted vessel of just 10 to 40 tons.
Its primary role was serving as a vital support vessel for the deep-sea fishing fleets. It would sail out, bring home their catches so the larger boats could keep fishing, ferry out fresh supplies.
Or act as a shallow draft lighter, discharging bulk cargo directly onto shallow beaches or navigating far up winding, shallow creeks where no other ship could go.
It was a widespread, indispensable type in constant use across the coast of Scotland, all around the English seaboard, and across the Irish Sea.
These vessels absolutely did not possess the glamour of the San Gabriel or the terrifying, cannon-bristling presence of the Gribsunden, but their economic utility was absolute.
Without a doubt, these small vessels were the essential veins and capillaries of medieval European trade. Think of the logistics. A 500-ton carrack cannot simply pull up to a muddy 10-foot-deep riverfront in a medieval town.
It will run aground and snap its keel.
Without the fleets of Creers, Hoys, and Picards ferrying goods from the deep-water anchorages into the shallow ports, navigating the inland creeks, and supplying the fishing fleets, the large state-sponsored galleys and towering carracks literally could not function.
The cargo would rot at anchor. These small boats formed the wide, indispensable base of the entire maritime economic pyramid.
So what does this all mean?
Synthesizing this long journey through the historical and archaeological sources, we observe a profound, slow-burning technological and cultural evolution. We started with single-masted, open vessels relying on overlapping wooden planks and side-mounted steering oars, hugging the coastlines and waiting for the right wind.
By the end of the period, we arrive at highly complex, multi-masted, artillery-laden carvel ships guided by centerline stern rudders, capable of crossing uncharted oceans.
This progression illustrates a Europe that was becoming increasingly, inextricably connected by water. Shipwrights across the continent slowly shared technology, cautiously adapting brilliant designs like the deep-bellied cog and the flush-hulled caravel.
Despite the immense financial and mortal costs associated with experimental failures.
The northern and southern traditions, once completely distinct and isolated, ultimately hybridized to meet the immense economic and military demands of a rapidly changing world.
I want to leave you with a final thought to consider, building on the mechanics and history we have analyzed today. Consider the sheer, terrifying psychological leap required for a 15th century sailor. Think about spending your entire life working on a familiar, reliable, clinker-built coastal trader.
You know the sounds it makes.
You are accustomed to feeling the hull literally flex and yield over the waves, just as your ancestors' ships had done for centuries. And then, you are asked to step off that familiar vessel and onto a multi-masted carvel ship, a rigid, towering fortress of fleshwood, complex rigging, and canvas, bound not just for the next port, but for completely uncharted, terrifying oceans.
The technology changed dramatically, the construction methods were completely revolutionized, and the math required to balance the sails multiplied.
But the raw human bravery required to test those untested innovations against the deep, unforgiving sea remained entirely the same. How much of our modern interconnected world was built simply because an unknown shipwright decided to change the shape of a rudder or add a second mast, and a crew found the courage to cast off the lines and see if it would hold together in a storm.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.